The story of Jeremiah Aldrich does not begin with wealth, power, or prestige. It begins with dust, hunger, and the gnawing shame of failure. His father, Henry Aldrich, was a tobacco farmer in Kentucky whose fields had long ago turned sour. By the late 1830s, Henry's debts outnumbered his remaining acres, and the family name carried no more weight than the rusted plow abandoned behind their cabin. Jeremiah grew up watching his father barter tools and livestock for scraps of credit, watching his mother dilute cornmeal with creek water to stretch out a week's worth of meals. That poverty carved into him something more dangerous than hunger. It gave him an obsession, to never be poor again. In 1839, at the age of 24, Jeremiah left Kentucky with nothing more than a single carpet bag, a pistol, and a determination that would turn him into one of the most feared names in Louisiana. He took a riverboat down the Ohio and then the Mississippi, riding past plantations that glittered with white-columned houses and fields lined with enslaved workers. To him they weren't fields. They were fortunes, living proof that men could rise from dirt to power if they were ruthless enough. When Jeremiah stepped off the boat in New Orleans, he wasn't stepping into the fabled elegance of the French Quarter or the grand salons of the Creole elite. He arrived in the shadows, at the docks, where whiskey mixed with river mud and the cries of chained men echoed from the hulls of ships. New Orleans in 1839 was a city of contradictions, velvet and blood, chandeliers and shackles. While respectable Creole families boasted of their sugar wealth and pretended their hands were clean, the underbelly of the city thrived on darker commerce. And Jeremiah, with his sharp eyes and sharper desperation, gravitated there immediately. It was in those dockside taverns that he first heard the whispers. Not all the slave ships crossing the Atlantic had stopped, despite the official ban on international slave trading. Some captains, lured by profits that outweighed risk, still brought human cargo from Cuba, the Caribbean, and even Africa itself. The old Creole families distanced themselves from this trade. To them it was too raw, too brutal, too direct. They preferred the illusion that their fortunes came solely from cotton, sugar, and rice. But there were always men willing to deal in the shadows. Jeremiah realized quickly that this was his way in. The summer of 1840 was suffocating, the kind of heat that seemed to peel skin from bone. It was then that Jeremiah met the two men who would help him build his first empire of misery, Marcus Devo and Samuel Rochelle. Marcus Devo was the youngest son of a sugar dynasty in decline. His family estate in St. Charles Parish was crumbling, creditors circling like vultures. Desperate for cash, Marcus was willing to gamble on anything that might restore his family's place among the Creole elite. He had charm, connections, and just enough arrogance to convince himself that the risk was worth it. Samuel Rochelle, by contrast, was a broken man. A former ship captain, he had lost both his fortune and his family to yellow fever and bad investments. His only remaining asset was knowledge, the kind no banker would accept as collateral but which proved priceless to men like Jeremiah. Rochelle knew the Caribbean routes, the hidden inlets, the smugglers' codes. He knew how to move flesh across the Gulf without attracting too much attention. Together, the three of them formed what they would later call the Delta Trading Company. The name was chosen deliberately. It sounded legitimate, almost respectable, like something that might own a fleet of steamboats or deal in river cotton. But behind that thin veneer was a machine of human suffering. Their operation was simple and devastatingly effective. While licensed slave traders conducted business with documents, titles, and health certificates, the Delta men specialized in what they called recovery services. In practice, that meant buying enslaved people who had escaped, purchasing kidnapped free blacks from corrupt bounty hunters, and, most lucratively, smuggling new captives from illegal ships. They operated out of a warehouse on the edge of New Orleans where the law's reach grew thin and bribes could silence any official with wandering eyes. The profits were staggering. Because they spent almost nothing on food, shelter, or medical care for their merchandise, every sale was nearly pure gain. Devo funneled his cut back into his family estate, rebuilding it into one of the most productive sugar operations in the parish. Rochelle began assembling a fleet of riverboats, slowly reshaping his ruined reputation into that of a respected shipping magnate. And Jeremiah, always hungriest of the three, poured his earnings into Willowbrook Plantation, a cotton estate about 40 miles upriver from New Orleans. The purchase of Willowbrook marked Jeremiah's transformation. No longer was he the poor son of a failed Kentucky farmer. He was now a planter, a man who could stand beside the Creole elite and pretend he belonged. He commissioned a grand colonial mansion, its white columns rising above the cane fields as if announcing his arrival to the world. He filled its halls with oil paintings of ancestors who weren't his own and shelves of books he couldn't read, symbols of a respectability he could never truly buy but would always hunger after. But beneath the facade, the Delta Trading Company continued to churn. Its ledgers, if they had survived, would tell stories of countless lives stolen, broken, and sold. Yet in New Orleans society, Jeremiah was no longer seen as an ambitious drifter. He was becoming one of them. What no one yet realized was that his ambition carried a poison. Jeremiah wasn't content with being wealthy. He wanted to control every thread of his world, to bend others to his will no matter the cost. And it was that hunger, the hunger born in Kentucky's dust, that would lead him down the darkest paths Louisiana had ever seen. What happened next, however, would test even his cruelty. By 1843, their shadow empire had grown so profitable that it drew attention, not from competitors but from the law. And with the law came paranoia, betrayal, and a decision that would turn Jeremiah Aldrich from a criminal into a murderer. But before we descend into the blood-soaked year of 1843, remember, every fortune in the antebellum South carried secrets. Jeremiah's secret was simply more terrible than most. Stay with me because the story of Willowbrook Plantation is only just beginning. By 1840, Jeremiah Aldrich had begun carving a place for himself in New Orleans' shadows. The docks were alive with commerce, bales of cotton, barrels of sugar, and crates of molasses moving steadily to the rhythm of the river. But beneath that rhythm was another current, darker and more profitable, and it was in that current that the Delta Trading Company was born. It started with a handshake in a smoke-choked tavern where sailors gambled away their pay and brothels made more money than warehouses. Jeremiah sat at a splintered table with Marcus Devo and Samuel Rochelle, three men bound not by friendship but by desperation. Each saw in the others an opportunity, Devo with his family's failing estate, Rochelle with his knowledge of sea routes, and Jeremiah with his relentless hunger for power. They called their venture the Delta Trading Company. The name sounded clean, legitimate, even noble, something that might invest in steamship lines or cotton gins. But in truth, it was a facade for one of the most ruthless slave operations Louisiana had ever known. The Delta men perfected a business model that balanced cunning with brutality. Licensed traders dealt with documented property, slaves registered, inspected, and taxed. Their prices reflected the costs of feeding, clothing, and housing the enslaved before sale. The Delta men had no such expenses. Their merchandise came from three primary sources, all of them steeped in misery. The first were fugitives, enslaved people who had run from failed plantations. With the right bribes, bounty hunters delivered these runaways to the Delta warehouse, often under forged claims that they had been lawfully captured. The second were free blacks kidnapped from northern states or seized from the streets of New Orleans itself. Corrupt patrolmen and criminal gangs worked hand in hand with Jeremiah's men, selling these captives to the Delta Company as though they had always been enslaved. The legality of their bondage was questionable, but in the chaos of the slave markets, paperwork could be forged and questions rarely asked. The third and most lucrative came from across the ocean. Rochelle used his maritime contacts to intercept smuggling ships from Cuba and the Caribbean islands. Despite the federal ban on international slave trading, vessels still carried human cargo to Gulf waters, where officials could be bribed to look the other way. The Delta warehouse became a silent gateway for these captives, who were sold at staggering profit margins. Jeremiah understood one cruel truth: desperation breeds silence. The men they employed, dock workers, corrupt customs officials, bounty hunters, were too compromised to speak. They had blood on their hands and blood kept secrets. For 3 years the company thrived. Devo restored his family's fortune, turning creditors into supplicants as his sugar fields roared back to life. Rochelle purchased riverboats, ferrying goods up and down the Mississippi with a respectability that masked his darker dealings. And Jeremiah, always the hungriest, invested every dollar into Willowbrook Plantation, his cotton fields expanding alongside his ambitions. The warehouse on the outskirts of New Orleans became their headquarters. It was an unremarkable structure to the casual eye: timber walls, iron-banded doors, the smell of molasses mixing with the stench of sweat. But inside, its ledgers told a different story. Names stripped from men and women, bodies reduced to numbers, profits rising with every transaction. If those ledgers still existed, historians would call them some of the darkest records in the American South. But they disappeared, just as so many people disappeared through the Delta Company's trade. The partnership was not without tension. Devo's aristocratic pride often clashed with Rochelle's rough pragmatism. Jeremiah, playing both sides, served as mediator while quietly positioning himself as the true architect of their success. He learned to mimic the manners of Creole gentlemen, practicing a drawl, buying imported suits, hosting dinners in his half-furnished mansion. But behind the charm was calculation. Jeremiah was no mere businessman. He was already thinking about how to cut loose the very men who had helped him rise. The profits made them careless. They drank openly in public, boasting of their successes with vague hints that others mistook for legitimate ventures. They purchased properties at prices too high to be questioned, flaunting their sudden wealth. But in the shadowy alleys of New Orleans, whispers spread. Someone was asking questions. In the spring of 1843, federal marshals began investigating rumors of illegal slave trading along the Gulf Coast. Shipping records were scrutinized, captains interrogated, and even freed men were quietly interviewed about where they had come from. For the first time, the Delta Company felt the heat of exposure. The three partners convened an emergency meeting at Willowbrook, Jeremiah's grand plantation still smelling of fresh paint. Surrounded by shelves of books he couldn't read and portraits of ancestors who weren't his, they argued late into the night. Devo, the most nervous, wanted to dissolve the company immediately, to burn the ledgers, erase all traces and retreat into their respectable lives. Rochelle, hardened by years at sea, counseled patience. Shift the assets offshore, wait for the investigation to pass, and resume once the storm blew over. Jeremiah said little. He poured drinks, listened to the crackle of the fire, and let the other two expose their fears. Because in his mind, he had already chosen another path. The Delta Trading Company had given him everything: wealth, land, the illusion of honor. But it had also tied him to men who knew his darkest secrets. Sooner or later one of them might talk. Sooner or later one of them might decide Jeremiah himself was expendable. And Jeremiah Aldrich would not be expendable. The solution came to him with the clarity of a snake's strike. To secure his fortune and erase all evidence of the Delta Trading Company, he would eliminate Marcus Devo and Samuel Rochelle. But it would not be done with open confrontation. Jeremiah was cunning enough to understand appearances. If he was to survive, their deaths must look like anything but murder. So he began to plan, not with rage or desperation, but with cold, deliberate calculation. He purchased a pistol, keeping it hidden in his coat. He sharpened a skinning knife until its edge could peel a sheet of paper without tearing it. He recruited dockworkers, bribed with coin and whiskey, to swear that Devo and Rochelle had quarreled violently over missing funds. And he chose his stage, the Delta warehouse, soon to be demolished as the city expanded its commercial port. It was perfect. Abandoned after dark, scheduled for destruction, it was a place where blood could be spilled and buried without consequence. The day was set for June 1843. The excuse was simple: one last meeting to discuss the fate of their enterprise, a final chance to agree on an exit strategy. Jeremiah prepared the table with whiskey and ledgers, just as they had so many times before. To Devo and Rochelle, it was a routine council of thieves. To Jeremiah, it was the beginning of the end. What unfolded that night would shatter the partnership forever, and it would mark the first of many deaths that followed Jeremiah Aldrich like shadows. Because in the heart of that warehouse, ambition was about to turn into murder. The night was thick with heat, the kind of southern humidity that turned the air itself into a weight pressing down on every breath. The Mississippi's slow churn drifted through the open slats of the warehouse, carrying with it the sour tang of stagnant water, rotting wood, and coal smoke from steamers moving upriver. Lanterns cast their dim, greasy light across the warped floorboards, illuminating crates stacked high with ledgers, empty bottles, and promises of riches that had already soured. It was here that Jeremiah Aldrich gathered with his two partners, Devo and Rochelle, for what was meant to be a reconciliation. A night of whiskey, numbers, and uneasy truce. At least that was the story. Devo, tall and lean with his constant sneer, sprawled across a chair with a bottle in hand. Rochelle, more careful, sat with his sleeves rolled up, carefully balancing ledgers in the dim light. Jeremiah stood apart from them, the glint of sweat on his forehead catching the lantern glow. His silence that night was heavier than the heat. "Money's gone missing," Rochelle muttered, flipping through the ink-stained pages. His voice trembled, though he tried to hide it. "If we don't account for it, we'll have planters at our throats." Devo laughed, bitter and slurred. "Planters? Or Jeremiah? He's been skimming. Look at him, too quiet, too smug." Jeremiah's jaw tightened. He said nothing. He poured another round instead, letting the whiskey catch the lamplight. What none of them knew, what only Jeremiah had already decided, was that this was no meeting. It was an execution. The first shot cracked louder than thunder. The sound of iron striking flesh and bone ricocheted off the warehouse walls. Devo lurched forward, clutching at his chest, his sneer finally erased. replaced by the shock of a man realizing he would never take another drink. He collapsed across the table, spilling whiskey across Rochelle's open ledgers. Rochelle scrambled to his feet, eyes wide, but Jeremiah was already moving. He seized the knife from the table, one Rochelle had brought to slice tobacco leaves earlier, and drove it deep into the man's side. The struggle was brief, muffled by the roar of Jeremiah's breathing and Rochelle's desperate gasps. By the time Rochelle crumpled against the wall, the knife was slick in Jeremiah's grip. When it was over, the warehouse was silent again, save for the slow drip of blood on the floorboards. 2 partners gone. 2 obstacles erased. Jeremiah stood in the middle of it all, breathing hard, the pistol smoking faintly in one hand, the knife trembling in the other. His heart did not race with guilt. It pulsed with something colder, sharper, triumph. But Jeremiah Aldrich was not careless. If ambition had taught him anything, it was that murder without a story was suicide. He set the scene like a playwright arranging the final act. Devo, sprawled across the table, looked as though whiskey and rage had carried him to his end. Rochelle, knife wound blooming across his ribs, could be seen as the one who fought back. Jeremiah himself would be the survivor, the innocent man caught between 2 hot tempers. By the time dockworkers burst in, drawn by the sound of gunfire, Jeremiah was slumped against the wall, face pale, shirt stained with another man's blood. His pistol lay discarded, his expression crafted into the mask of a man too stunned to lie. He gasped, voice raw. They fought over money. I couldn't stop them. And the workers, half drunk themselves and eager to avoid trouble with the law, believed what their eyes told them. 2 dead men, 1 shaken survivor. The testimony was swift, shallow, and convenient. Dockworkers swore they'd seen Devo and Rochelle argue for weeks. Others whispered of debts, of missing coin. No one questioned why Jeremiah was left standing. No one wanted to. The coroner's notes were a single sentence. A dispute over funds turned violent. Within days, Devo and Rochelle were lowered into shallow graves, their names fading into the river's current. And Jeremiah Aldrich, bloody, shaken, and alive, walked free. But freedom was not enough. Jeremiah knew that what lingered in ledgers and papers could damn him more than corpses ever could. One night, under cover of rain, he returned to the warehouse. He carried oil, a lantern, and silence. By dawn, the Delta Trading Company was nothing more than ash and smoke, erased from the city's memory as though it had never existed. And so the path was cleared. By blood, by fire, by deceit. What unfolded in that warehouse was not just the death of 2 men. It was the birth of something darker. A man remade in violence. A name that would begin to crawl into the whispers of the city. Jeremiah Aldrich had proven he was willing to kill for ambition. And the world, New Orleans, Louisiana, and beyond, would soon learn that he would not stop. Because men like Jeremiah do not rise clean. They rise on corpses. And from that night on, every acre he gained, every coin he counted, would be shadowed by the memory of blood spilled in a warehouse by the river. By 1858, Jeremiah Aldrich was a ghost of the man who had once commanded hundreds of acres and dozens of enslaved workers. His once broad shoulders slumped forward. His breath came in ragged wheezes. To visitors, it appeared as though his very flesh was rotting while he still lived. His skin turned grayish and sagged, his belly bloated, his teeth loosened. Yet through all this, one habit never changed. He continued to eat everything Celeste placed before him. Witnesses said the scenes at the dining table grew more grotesque by the year. Jeremiah, pale and sweating, would sit slumped in his chair as Celeste approached with steaming trays. She would cut his food into small pieces, spooning it into his mouth as though feeding an invalid child. The air reeked of grease and blood. Servants claimed that sometimes Jeremiah gagged, begging for rest, but Celeste pressed him on, her expression calm, almost satisfied. Rumors spread that she sang to him in the kitchen, low, humming songs with no words anyone could understand. Slaves whispered that the melodies were old African chants, prayers to spirits whose names no preacher dared speak. White neighbors dismissed these tales as superstition, but none could deny that Jeremiah was wasting away under his wife's watchful eye. And still he refused to let her go. When a cousin from Baton Rouge visited, horrified by Jeremiah's decline, he urged that Celeste be sent away, that the marriage be annulled. Jeremiah erupted into a fury. "She is my wife," he croaked, "and I'll hear no blasphemy against her." Yet behind his eyes there was terror, a flicker of something unspoken. As though the very idea of separation was more frightening to him than death. The plantation itself reflected his ruin. Cotton yields plummeted. Overseers reported that the fields went untended, as if the very soil had soured. Livestock died mysteriously, cows stiff in the pasture, pigs found bloated near the troughs. A visitor described the plantation as a place where the air itself seemed thick with sickness. In the parish, whispers spread that Aldrich land was cursed. Then came the spring of 1859. Neighbors remembered seeing Jeremiah in church for the last time. He was too weak to stand, propped up by two men, his body wrapped in a heavy coat though the Louisiana heat was suffocating. His skin was blotched, his hair thinned to wisps. But what unsettled the congregation most was not his condition, it was the sight of Celeste seated beside him. She did not bow her head during prayer. She did not sing. Instead, she stared, unblinking, at the preacher, as if daring him to question her place in the pews. Parishioners later swore her lips moved, silently echoing words that did not match the sermon. Mothers clutched their children closer, afraid to look too long at her face. Within weeks, Jeremiah vanished from public life altogether. Plantation workers reported that he no longer left his bed. His chamber reeked of sweat, spoiled food, and the faint metallic tang of blood. A doctor was called from New Orleans, but after a single visit he refused to return, saying only, "That man is beyond earthly medicine." And yet Jeremiah lived on, barely. Kept alive, many believed, not by will or chance but by Celeste's hand. Visitors described hearing strange noises at night. Groans from Jeremiah's room, punctuated by the scrape of dishes and the faint splash of liquid. Sometimes a scream would cut through the dark, only to be muffled moments later. On such nights, the kitchen chimney belched smoke until dawn, filling the air with a nauseating smell of burnt fat. It was then that the legend of Celeste hardened into something more than gossip. Some said she was practicing a form of hoodoo, binding Jeremiah to her through food laced with herbs, powders, or poisons. Others claimed she was exacting a slow revenge for years of bondage, turning her master into her captive, feeding him toward an endless death that never quite arrived. But there was another story, darker still, that Jeremiah was not merely her victim but her offering. That with each meal, each spoonful pressed past his trembling lips, she was feeding something else, something unseen that hungered in the shadows of the Aldrich home. By 1860, Jeremiah Aldrich was a name spoken only in whispers. His plantation decayed, his kin avoided him, his neighbors locked their doors at night when the wind carried the scent of smoke from his chimneys. The marriage that had begun as a cruel bet had become something else entirely, a bond no one dared question, a grotesque union of master and servant that blurred the lines between love, power, and damnation. And through it all, Celeste endured. Silent, watchful, unmoving. The woman who had once stirred pots in the kitchen now presided over the entire estate like a grim sentinel. Her husband's body wasted, her household crumbled, yet she remained, the constant, unyielding presence at the center of a nightmare that seemed to have no end. For in the South of that era, death came swiftly to many. But to Jeremiah Aldrich, under Celeste's hand, death came slowly. Too slowly. As though someone, or something, was savoring every bite. The summer of 1843 in New Orleans was remembered as one of the most suffocating on record. The air hung heavy with humidity, every breath clinging to the skin like wet cloth. By day, the port teemed with ships and shouting dockworkers, but by night the wharves fell silent, save for the occasional creak of rigging or the shuffle of rats searching for scraps. It was in this silence, on a humid June night, that Jeremiah Aldrich invited his two business partners to a final meeting at the warehouse that had served as the beating heart of the Delta Trading Company. The building stood at the edge of the commercial district, a cavernous shell of timber and brick scheduled soon for demolition. Its windows were broken, its floorboards warped from decades of salt air. By daylight, it bustled with crates and chains, whispers of forbidden cargo. But on this night, the only light came from a single lantern flickering atop a scarred wooden table. Upon it, Aldrich had arranged 3 glasses, a bottle of fine whiskey, and a stack of ledgers bound in cracked leather. Marcus Devo arrived first, sweating through his linen coat despite the hour. He was tense, his eyes darting nervously around the room, as though expecting marshals to burst through the shadows at any moment. Samuel Rochelle followed soon after, his sailor's gait steady, his expression wary but controlled. The 3 men had built an empire together, trafficking in flesh, misery, and desperation. Now that empire trembled on the brink of collapse. Aldrich greeted them with forced warmth, gesturing toward the table. "One last drink before we decide our course," he said, pouring amber liquid into each glass. His voice was calm, but beneath it his mind was a storm. Hidden in his coat pocket lay a pistol, fully loaded. Strapped to his boot was a skinning knife, honed to a razor's edge. They drank. Devo launched immediately into his fears. He had heard whispers of federal investigators following their trail, questions asked in Baton Rouge, ledgers examined in Mobile, survivors of their trade sought out for testimony. His words tumbled out in a rush, his hands trembling as he gripped the glass. "We must burn everything, records, receipts, names," he insisted. "End it now before we all hang." Rochelle, cooler by nature, shook his head. "No. We move the money offshore. Wait for the heat to pass. Marshals come and go, but gold in Havana will last a lifetime." His tone was measured, but his eyes narrowed at Aldrich, as if sensing his partner's silence hid something more than contemplation. Aldrich leaned back in his chair, watching them argue. Devo's panic, Rochelle's pragmatism, it was all as he expected. He allowed the debate to build, voices rising, fists slamming against the table, the tension in the room mounting like thunder before a storm. Then, in a moment of calculated calm, he acted. The pistol cracked through the silence like a lightning strike. Marcus Devo staggered back, clutching his chest, eyes wide with shock. Blood spread across his shirt in a dark bloom. He fell against the crates stacked by the wall, knocking them over with a crash before crumpling to the floor. Rochelle roared in fury, leaping to his feet. His hand went for the knife at his belt, but Aldrich was faster. In a blur, he drew the skinning blade from his boot and lunged. Steel met flesh in a brutal struggle, the two men grappling, slipping on the sweat-slick floorboards. Rochelle landed a glancing blow across Aldrich's forearm, but the plantation man twisted free, driving the knife deep into Rochelle's side. The sailor gasped, staggered, and collapsed beside Devo's lifeless body. Blood pooled quickly, soaking into the warped wood, filling the room with the sharp iron stench of death. For a long moment, the only sound was Aldrich's own ragged breathing. His hand shook as he wiped the blade clean on Rochelle's coat. Then, with methodical precision, he set the scene. He dragged Devo's body closer, placing the knife in Rochelle's stiffening hand. He toppled the whiskey bottle, letting its contents spill across the ledgers, staining them like false evidence of a drunken quarrel. He overturned the chairs, scattering papers as though in the chaos of a fight. Every motion was deliberate, calculated, rehearsed in his mind for weeks. When he was done, the story was written. Two desperate men, partners turned enemies, slain by greed and suspicion. And Jeremiah Aldrich, lucky survivor, shaken but blameless. The final act of the play was already prepared. Outside, in the humid dark, 3 dockside men loitered, paid in advance to speak on his behalf. When summoned later, they would swear they had overheard Devo and Rochelle quarreling bitterly over missing money earlier that day. They would testify to tempers flaring, to threats exchanged. Their words would seal the illusion Aldrich had crafted with blood. By dawn, the warehouse stood quiet again. Only the dark stains on the floor bore witness to the treachery that had taken place. The bodies were discreetly removed, their burials unmarked, their families silenced with bribes or threats. The Delta Trading Company ceased to exist, its records burned, its name erased. But its fortune lived on. With Devo and Rochelle gone, Aldrich stood alone atop their ill-gotten empire. He claimed their assets, their lands, their ships. Within months, he purchased Willowbrook Plantation, complete with its grand colonial mansion, white columns gleaming against the Louisiana sun. To polite society, he appeared not as a trafficker but as a planter, a gentleman of means, a man whose origins were no longer questioned. Yet beneath the polished veneer, the truth lingered like a blood stain that would not wash away. Those who worked the plantation whispered that their new master was haunted, that shadows clung to him, that his sleep was broken by screams. Servants swore they heard footsteps in the halls at night, heavy boots that left no prints, voices murmuring in languages no one recognized. And always there was the warehouse. Though torn down the following year, its memory persisted. Dockworkers who passed the site claimed they smelled whiskey and blood when the wind shifted, as though the building itself refused to let go of its secrets. The warehouse murders, as they would later be called in hushed tones, marked the first step in Jeremiah Aldrich's transformation, from ambitious trader to cursed master, from survivor to victim of his own deceit. For while he had succeeded in erasing his partners, he had not erased their vengeance. And vengeance, once planted in blood, takes root in ways no man can control. By 1844, Jeremiah Aldrich had cleansed his hands in the eyes of the law, though not in truth. The Delta Trading Company, once whispered of in every tavern along the river, no longer appeared on ledgers. Its books were burned, its partners dead or vanished, and only Aldrich remained, a survivor, cloaked in a respectability he had not earned. He used his blood-stained inheritance to buy legitimacy. Land parcels were stitched together until they formed a sprawling estate, which he christened Willowbrook, a name chosen to soften the hard truth of cotton rows and human bondage. It was here, amid the swamp air and the monotonous hum of cicadas, that Aldrich began his ascent as a Southern planter. The parish court records show a brief but telling union. In 1846, Aldrich married Margaret Duval, daughter of a middling family with aspirations above their means. For a season, Willowbrook entertained guests under the banner of polite society. Ladies came to sip juleps in its parlor, men to talk politics on its porch. Margaret played the role expected of her, until within a year she was gone. The official record cites fever, but neighbors whispered otherwise. She was last seen at supper, pale and trembling, unable to finish her meal. Days later she was buried in the family plot, her headstone already weathering before her story had cooled. Some claimed they saw Aldrich himself carrying her plate away, as though guarding what little remained. If questions lingered, they faded quickly. Wealth silences suspicion, and death was no stranger in Louisiana summers. Freed from domestic restraint, Aldrich sank deeper into the role he preferred. Master, not husband. He purchased more enslaved people to tend his fields, and with each transaction the tales of cruelty mounted. A field hand was beaten for missing his quota of cotton. Another was forced to stand in the cane brake for hours, lashed by mosquitoes for speaking out of turn. Yet it was not merely punishment, it was humiliation. Aldrich delighted in breaking dignity more than backs. It was during this grim era that Celeste entered the record. She appeared first in the inventory of 1848, female, cook, age uncertain, stout in size. But to those who labored in Willowbrook's kitchens and smokehouses, Celeste was far more than ink on paper. She was immense, broad-shouldered and heavy-set, her presence commanding any room she entered. Her tongue was sharp, her wit dangerous, and though she bore the yoke of slavery, she carried herself with the pride of one who knew she was indispensable. Celeste was Aldrich's cook, and with that role came power both subtle and terrifying. The plantation's life passed through her hands, meats smoked, breads baked, stews simmered in great iron pots. Enslaved people said Aldrich demanded more than meals. He forced mockeries of servitude, parading Celeste before guests, laughing as he ordered her to sing or to serve whiskey on her knees. Such humiliations hardened into rumor, and rumor hardened into fear, that the kitchen of Willowbrook was cursed, its hearth a place of unholy bargains. Neighbors scoffed at such tales, yet they noticed odd things. Smoke rose from the kitchen long after midnight, carrying smells both rich and rancid. Guests reported that Aldrich would not eat from anyone's hand but Celeste's, even spurning servants to have her deliver his plate directly. It was as though the plantation master was already bound to her, though the bond had not yet been formalized. Between 1844 and 1850, Willowbrook thrived on paper. Its cotton yields grew, its master appeared in parish rolls as a man of standing. But beneath the facade, whispers circulated, that Jeremiah Aldrich was not merely building a plantation, but weaving a curse into its very soil. A curse that began with his cruelty, deepened with Celeste's presence, and would one day consume them both. The year was 1854, a summer heavy with heat and swollen with mosquitoes. In the French Quarter of New Orleans, Jeremiah Aldrich was far from Willowbrook's cotton rows. He sat instead beneath the smoky chandeliers of Louvieux Care Club, a den where Creole elites mixed with river merchants, gamblers, and men who measured worth not in honor but in gold and land. Whiskey flowed as easily as the Mississippi outside, and Aldrich, with his flushed cheeks and booming laugh, drank deep from the bottle as though trying to drown every shadow of his past. The evening began with cards, then dice, then with stories told too loud, each man determined to outdo the other in bravado. They mocked one another's plantations, their wives, their fortunes. By midnight, the air stank of sweat and liquor, and the talk turned cruel. It was a planter from St. Bernard Parish, Louis Marigny, known for his sharp tongue, who struck first. Leaning across the table, his eyes glazed with drink, he sneered, "Jeremiah, you boast of Willowbrook as though it were Versailles. But what empire is ruled by a cook? Tell us, do you kiss her hand before she serves your supper?" Laughter cracked across the table like a whip. Men slapped their knees, spit whiskey and mirth. Aldrich stiffened, his pride inflamed. Celeste, his cook, his shadow, his humiliation. She was whispered about already, her size and sharpness the subject of cruel jokes. But to have her thrown in his face by men he considered equals, that was intolerable. "Mind your tongue," Aldrich growled, though his words slurred. But the jeers only deepened. Another voice chimed in, "I'll wager you wouldn't dare make her your wife." Not the mighty Jeremiah Aldrich. Not with that fat wench. The insult cut deeper than the bed itself. In a haze of whiskey and arrogance, Aldrich slammed his fist upon the table, rattling the empty tumblers. "Write it down," he roared. "I'll sign the paper tonight. Jeremiah Aldrich marries whom he damn well pleases." The club erupted in chaos, some laughing, some egging him on, others scrambling to fetch ink and parchment. Whether from cruelty or drunken delight, they drafted a mock marriage certificate on the spot, daring him to prove his boast. Aldrich, sweating and red-faced, scrawled his name with a trembling hand. And then, like wolves scenting blood, they demanded more. "Fetch her," Marigny cried. "Fetch the cook. Let us see this union sealed." The details are blurred by time, but the parish archives do not lie. By dawn, a certificate existed in the Louisiana State Archives, yellowed today but unbroken by the years. On its brittle surface, beneath Jeremiah Aldrich's signature, was written the single word beside Celeste's name: property. To the drunken men it was a jest, a humiliation that would echo across drawing rooms and parlors, whispered as proof that Aldrich's pride had been broken on the back of his own arrogance. To Aldrich himself, it was a hollow victory, proof he would wager anything to defend his name. But for Celeste the meaning was different. Dragged from the kitchen into a drunken charade, mocked before men who saw her as less than human, she stood silent as ink dried upon the page. In that silence lay something dangerous. Neighbors would later remark that she showed no shame, no tears. Only a stillness in her eyes, a stillness that unsettled those who looked too long. Some whispered she endured the humiliation as a wound. Others said she accepted it as a weapon. Either way, a seed had been planted in that moment, a seed of vengeance that would grow, watered by blood and bitterness, into the legend that haunted Willowbrook for generations. Thus, with whiskey and arrogance, Jeremiah Aldrich bound himself to Celeste. Not in love, not in honor, but in the grotesque parody of both. And from that night, the fate of Willowbrook bent toward ruin. The wedding of Jeremiah Aldrich and Celeste, mocked in parlors and whispered through plantations, was never meant to be remembered as anything more than a drunken spectacle. Yet within weeks of that yellowed certificate signing, Willowbrook began to bleed death into the Mississippi soil. The first to fall was Jonathan Kells, the overseer. A hard, brutal man whose whip sang louder than the cicadas, Kells had managed Willowbrook's fields for nearly a decade. In July of 1854, after a supper of roast pork and cornbread from Celeste's kitchen, he staggered from the table, retching violently. By morning he was dead, his skin gray, lips blue, his throat scorched as though fire had been poured inside. Whispers rose like smoke. Some muttered cholera, others bad whiskey, but behind hands and in hushed tones came another word: poison. 3 weeks later another man dropped. This time it was Henry Tate, a visiting cotton broker from Natchez. He had dined with Aldrich, praising Celeste's famed stews, and within hours was found in his bed, his limbs rigid, eyes frozen in terror. The pattern unfolded with dreadful regularity. By winter the death toll had risen to 6. Overseers, hired men, a bookkeeper, even 2 guests of Aldrich's gambling circle. All struck down suddenly, violently, after meals from Willowbrook's kitchen. 13 in total by the spring of 1855. 13 souls swallowed by an unseen hand. Local papers carried whispers but never names. The New Orleans Daily Picayune printed a short piece in November 1854 about a strange illness afflicting certain gentlemen of standing in St. Charles Parish. Another paper, the Louisiana Courier, hinted that a contagion, or perhaps something darker, stalks among the plantations upriver. But Willowbrook itself was never directly named. It was not ignorance, it was protection. Too many of the dead carried weighty surnames, tied by blood or money to Louisiana's elite. For the authorities to dig too deeply into Willowbrook meant unearthing scandals that threatened the very fabric of the Creole aristocracy. Better, it seemed, to let the soil keep its secrets. Still, rumors cannot be buried. On porches, in taverns, along the river docks, the story grew. They said Celeste's stews carried more than spice. That her heavy ladle stirred powders ground from roots and berries whispered to kill silently. Some claimed she had learned from elders who still carried the old knowledge of poisons, recipes traced back to Africa and preserved in whispers among the enslaved. Others whispered something darker still, that this was no matter of roots or powders but of curses. They said Celeste had been humiliated before God and man, and in silence had bound her rage into every meal she served. One traveler from Baton Rouge wrote in his diary, "They speak of Willowbrook as a house where supper is a wager, and every plate a coin flipped against the grave." Through it all, Jeremiah Aldrich clung to denial. He raged at his surviving overseers, swore vengeance upon anyone spreading nonsense about curses, and yet he too began to avoid his wife's table. Witnesses noted how he drank heavily, often pouring more whiskey than food, his once proud face puffed and bloodshot. By early 1855, Willowbrook's reputation was sealed. Guests no longer came. Field hands worked in fearful silence. Neighbors avoided Aldrich's company, while in New Orleans parlors, women lowered their voices when his name arose. 13 dead in less than a year. No charges filed. No inquest pursued. Only a marriage certificate, a cook with unreadable eyes, and the growing certainty that Willowbrook Plantation was no longer merely a place of cotton and profit, it was a place of death. And still the killing was not done. By the spring of 1855, Jeremiah Aldrich was no longer the man who had once cut deals in New Orleans drawing rooms with a predator's smile. At Willowbrook, the proud planter had become a figure of decay, paranoid, hollow-eyed, his voice breaking in sudden rages that echoed through the plantation halls. Neighbors who rode past at night claimed they heard screams carried on the damp Louisiana air, anguished shouts followed by pounding footsteps, sometimes answered by a woman's low, guttural singing. The enslaved whispered that Aldrich often woke thrashing, gasping for air, calling out the names of men long dead, Marcus Devo, Samuel Rochelle. He swore he saw them in his chambers, their shirts still blooming with blood, their eyes glassy and accusing. Most chilling of all were the stories that spread among the quarters, that Celeste did not sleep. She moved by candlelight, stirring pots at midnight, murmuring in tongues older than the soil of Louisiana. Field hands claimed she was feeding not only the living but also the dead, that Devo and Rochelle themselves sat at her table in spirit, guiding her hand in vengeance. Aldrich's paranoia grew so severe that he attempted to erase the humiliation at the root of it all. In July of 1855, he petitioned the parish court for annulment of his marriage. His argument was that Celeste could not be his wife if she was legally enslaved property. Yet when the judge examined the brittle certificate, he found Aldrich's own signature binding. The document listed Celeste as property beneath his name, yes, but signed it remained, and so binding it stood. The law, in its irony, trapped him. What had begun as a drunken bet became an unbreakable chain. Aldrich, planter and master, was tied forever to the woman he mocked before the Creole elite. As the months bled into autumn, his decline was plain to all who still dared cross his threshold. He took his meals alone, refusing food from Celeste's kitchen, surviving instead on whiskey and salted meat brought from town. His once broad shoulders sagged, his skin turned sallow, and his voice grew hoarse from endless muttering. Plantation accounts from that year show a collapse in order. Overseers resigned or fled. Crops rotted in the field. The enslaved, long terrified of Aldrich's lash, began to speak more freely among themselves, certain that their master was already doomed. Visitors described him as a ghost in his own house. One planter's wife wrote after a brief call, "He sat in the parlor, shaking, with a pistol on the table before him. He accused me of seeing her shadow in the hall behind him. Yet when I turned there was nothing. His eyes darted like a man hunted." By winter, Jeremiah Aldrich was rarely seen outside his chambers. The man who once built an empire on blood and deceit had collapsed into raving solitude, haunted by the wife he could neither command nor cast aside. Willowbrook, once a jewel of the parish, had become a house of whispers. And its master, undone by his own pride, was already circling the grave he had dug for so many others. The end of Jeremiah Aldrich's story was never as tidy as the newspapers pretend to be. There was no neat courtroom drama, no righteous hanging, no vindicating headline. Instead it arrived like the rest of his life had, slow, ambiguous, and wrapped in rumor. By the time the parish gossips had finished trading their versions, there were half a dozen ways to tell his death. One account, whispered by a fearful housekeeper who left Willowbrook in the winter of 1855, said she found him one morning in his bed with a noose slack beneath the rafters of his chamber. The pistol he had once kept on the parlor table lay discharged in a corner, and his face was pale and frozen, like a man who had finally given up a fight he could no longer win. Another version, told in low voices by a former overseer decades later, claimed Aldrich died at table, his cheek already drawn and lips blue, the skin around his mouth stained dark, an image that made listeners ask if the cook's stew had finally reached its master. Yet another iteration, offered by a clerk in the parish office, insists the coroner's report was curiously vague. Cause unknown, death unattended. Which of these versions is true is impossible to say with certainty. What is certain is the timing. By late 1855, the man who had built an empire on other men's suffering was gone. His body, whichever way it met the end, was buried quickly on the Aldrich family plot, a small marker placed and then left to weather. There would be no public inquiry that might open the doors to names and alliances those in power preferred to keep closed. Celeste vanished from the ledger much like she had vanished from polite society, without record and with more theories than facts. In the months after Aldrich's death, plantation hands said she was seen loading a trunk at the back of the kitchen, calm as ever, her broad silhouette lantern lit against the smoke-darkened bricks. Some swore she slipped away on a foggy night down to the river, and from there, so the rumor went, she was spirited north by abolitionist contacts and guided into the hidden routes of the Underground Railroad. The version favored by others was far less generous. They insisted she had been buried beneath a mound in the slave quarter, her grave unmarked, the soil turned and tamped by hands who would never speak her name. A handful of older families claimed she simply disappeared into the woods, taking with her the recipes and secrets of Willowbrook and walking off into anonymity. No consistent record traces her final steps. If she fled, there are no verified papers of emancipation, no letters, no census entry that can be tied to her with confidence. If she died on the plantation, there is no marked grave and no ledger that records the expense. In the official sense, Celeste's life and ending are a blank where a name should be. That blank, more than any judicial silence, became the seedbed for myth. Willowbrook itself did not long remain a good investment. Families that took the estate after the Aldrich line found little comfort in its rooms. Some reported doors that would not stay shut, footsteps that the house refused to hide, and the persistent smell of cooking fat and whiskey that clung to plaster and rafters like old varnish. One late 19th century purchaser quit within 2 years, selling the property at a loss and telling the buyer only that the house eats men. Over the decades, the plantation changed hands several times. None of its new masters made it a true home. Fields that once turned green for cotton fell to weeds, and dogs refused to cross the long drive at night. In parlors and at church socials the story mutated into legend. Parents telling children the tale of the fat cook and the proud planter softened it into moral instruction, warning that cruelty would be paid back in kind, that arrogance could be its own doom. Folk tales embroidered new scenes. Lantern-lit processions in the quarter where Celeste's kitchen smoke could be seen on some moonless nights, the reflected movement of a broad woman's silhouette in upstairs windows, the clatter of chains where none existed. Willowbrook, for many, was less a historical place than a living cautionary tale. Modern historians, more cynical and more careful, read the evidence with different eyes. They point to the patterns of silence in the records, the abrupt cessation of certain ledgers, the burned correspondence, the gaps in county inquests. Where local lore sees witchcraft or haunting, scholars see social protectionism, an elite more invested in preserving reputations than in pursuing truth. They note that among the dead were men connected by blood, marriage and business to prominent Creole families. An investigation that probed Willowbrook too deeply risked unwrapping a system of complicity that reached into the parishes and into New Orleans drawing rooms. Archival researchers in the 20th century have found hints of that complicity. Correspondence between shipping houses and merchants, redacted and partial, shows evidence of payments and favors exchanged to keep certain inquiries quiet. Court dockets from neighboring parishes contain references to private settlements and matters resolved by agreement. Newspapers from the period, those not under the sway of plantation interests, printed oblique articles about unpleasantness in the Delta, never naming names, never pushing further. The silence itself, historians argue, is the loudest evidence of a cover-up. Some academics have gone further, suggesting that Aldrich's very public rise to respectability was part of a social bargain. Men who had profited from the illegal trade were quietly absorbed into the planter class when they adopted its manners and invested their profits into the land. In exchange, those who could expose them were paid, threatened, or turned into silence by the sheer force of money and connectedness. The warehouse murders, in this reading, were not merely a private sin but a wound in the body of a society that preferred its blemishes hidden. And then there is the certificate itself, yellowed, brittle, and preserved in the state archives, a piece of paper that will not lie down. It sits now behind glass, catalogued and described as an oddity, the marriage record of Jeremiah Aldrich and a woman named Celeste, with the cruel annotation of property beside her name. For historians, the certificate is an object lesson in how law, language, and power intersected. For storytellers and for those who still whisper the tale in parish taverns, it is proof that what happened is not merely rumor. The document acts as a mute witness, an artifact that hints at a reality more sordid than a single narrative can contain. The last recorded facts close the legal book but open the imagination. No indictment. No trial. No public reconciliation. Willowbrook decayed physically as it had morally. The plantation might still stand in fragments, stone foundations shifting under kudzu, chimneys like ribs jutting into long grass, but its true endurance is in the stories passed down in the Delta. Stories of humiliation and revenge, of food that could carry death, and of a man who could not buy his way out of fate. So what do we make of it now? Is Celeste a villain, a victim, a survivor, or something else entirely? Was Jeremiah Aldrich punished by justice, by his own hand, or by the hand of a fate he had long cultivated in others? Historians will keep arguing, folklorists will keep telling. But one thing endures in black ink on fragile paper: the record of a marriage that should never have existed, a marriage that became a hinge upon which the tragedies of Willowbrook swung. This was Louisiana's darkest bet, signed, sealed, and left to fester in the margins of memory. If you want more of these forgotten and dangerous corners of history, subscribe and ring the bell. Tell us in the comments which artifact you want us to pull from the archives next, and where you're listening from. Because some objects keep their secrets only until someone asks the right question. This was Louisiana's darkest bet. Subscribe for more forgotten stories.